And recording started. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and you being here. And we would like to introduce a very good friend of Students Supporting Israel, Paul Gross, all the way from Israel, from the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. SSI have been working with Paul for the past few years since he started speaking to our students also by video at our national conferences. And we're very happy to keep doing it. Just a little bit introduction on Paul. Paul was born in the United Kingdom. Paul was working at the Embassy of Israel at UK in the Public Affairs Department and as the ambassador's speechwriter. He has a master's degree in Middle East politics from the University of London, and he is currently a senior fellow in Jerusalem. And Paul been, of course, made Aliyah and been living in Israel for many, many years now. So, Paul, thank you so much for being here. We're waiting to learn from you, and the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilan, and thank you for everyone, and also for the work that you do, Ilan, and everyone at Students Supporting Israel does. I think it's really some incredible achievements that you've done over a short period of time in making the case for Israel on campuses in the United States. Okay. I'm going to talk about how the Palestinians killed the peace camp. The subtitle that I've given it, The Return to the Iron Wall, I'll explain that in a little while, and some of you may get the reference. Firstly, just a word about definitions. When we talk about the peace camp in Israel, that doesn't mean, of course, that those not in the peace camp aren't interested in peace. I think we can safely say that most Israelis, if not all Israelis, want peace. The peace camp refers very specifically to the mainly left wing of Israel that in small numbers after 1967, but really in large numbers in the 1980s and 1990s, were pushing for a land for peace deal with the Palestinians. I'm going to talk about how support for that has declined and why. Let me start with this reference of the Iron Wall. Now, I'm mentioning it not just because I work at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center and Zev Jabotinsky is quite a big influence on the work that we do here, but also because I actually think the Iron Wall is quite a useful way to think about the divide that occurs between the left and the right over land for peace in the 80s and really solidifying in the 90s. So Jabotinsky writes this very influential essay in 1923 called The Iron Wall, in which he basically says that those in his own side, those on the Zionist in the Zionist movement, that are assuming that the Arabs will essentially give up the fight because their living standards improve and the Zionists make life all nice for them, are kidding themselves. As he says, as long as the Arabs feel that there is the least hope of getting rid of us, they will refuse to give up this hope in return for either kind words or for bread and butter, because they are not a rabble but a living people. And when a living people yields in matters of such a vital character, it is only when there is no longer any hope of getting rid of us, because they can make no breach in the iron wall. The iron wall he's talking about is obviously not physically a wall. It is military might. It is the building up of Zionist and then ultimately, of course, Israeli military might, which will prove impregnable, which will make the Arabs essentially give up the fight. He says, not till then will they drop their extremist leaders whose watchword is never, and the leadership will pass to the moderate groups who will approach us with a proposal that we should both agree to mutual concessions. Right, this is not a recipe for permanent war. Some of the critics of this essay, Jabotinsky, make the case that this is a sort of a recipe for militarism. Jabotinsky is saying that at the end of the day, there will be peace, and the way to get there is for the Jewish state to become so impregnable, to have such military might that it cannot be defeated, and then the extremist leaders whose watchword is never will be forced to pass the baton to more moderate groups. And really, we can look at the divide between left and right in the 80s and 90s as some sort of, as a disagreement in judgment as to whether that has happened, as to whether the extremist leaders whose watchword is never have become more moderate or have passed the baton to more moderate leaders. Before I go into some of the history, I want to zoom forward to the present, and then we'll go back to the history. So obviously the big contemporary story of the recent election was the final result, that we ended up with this unity government of Likud and blue and white, with Gantz splitting his party and joining Netanyahu. That was obviously the most important story for us today here in Israel. The big historic story was this, that the party of Israel's founding is essentially now just two members of Knesset. These two gentlemen here, Amir Peretz and Itzik Shmuley. The Labour Party, of which they are really now the only members in the Knesset, was the founding party of the state with slightly different iterations, but essentially the labor movement of David Ben Gurion, of Golda Meir, of Moshe Dayan, of Rabin and Peres, and others. And it's an extraordinary political story, an Israeli story, this catastrophe has occurred to the founding party of the state. The Labour Party were traditionally at the head of the peace camp. So let's go back and have a look at what happened. So I'm going to go back to 1979 and the Israel-Egypt peace deal. The 1980s begins with really the first success of the Iron Wall, right? The Iron Wall approach. Egypt, which is the leading Arab state and the major force behind the successive attempts to destroy Israel, effectively gives up. And Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, recognizes the logic of the Iron Wall, right, of Israel's military superiority. He knows that Israel isn't going anywhere. He recognizes Egypt's future lies as an ally of the United States, not with the Soviet Union. And he makes this dramatic speech in the Knesset in 1977, which explicitly recognizes Israel's right to live in peace and security as a permanent part of the Middle East. And that's what Jabotinsky was talking about, right? That we would reach a point where our enemies give up the fight. And that's what happened with Egypt. Now, the negotiations between Sadat and Menachem Begin, the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, also saw the emergence of Peace Now, which is a group of reserve army officers and soldiers in combat units who write this open letter to Begin, calling on him not to miss the opportunity to make peace. And in time, Peace Now become the major non-parliamentary wing of the peace camp. Right? They move, once peace with Egypt is secured, they then move on to the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian question comes up in the Israel-Egypt negotiations, but at that point, the PLO, which is the leading Palestinian nationalist movement, recognized by the Arabs at least as the representatives of Palestinian nationalism, was routinely committing acts of terrorism against Israelis and also supporters of Israel in the West. So there isn't the idea of any kind of talks or negotiations with the PLO are not on the table at this point. In fact, it's illegal in Israel at this point to have any dealings with the PLO. The Palestinian question becomes more urgent at the end of 1987 at the outbreak of the First Intifada. I don't want to get there's a lot of detail here which I could get into. I don't want to get too much into it because there's a lot to cover, but essentially, because we tend to think more now the Second Intifada in the beginning of the century, the two are very different, right? We'll get to the Second Intifada. The First Intifada, unlike the second, was very much a grassroots rebellion against Israeli presence in Gaza and Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. And it forced a lot of Israelis to think in a way that perhaps they hadn't before about the long-term future of Israeli presence there. And it forced them to start asking questions about whether it was tenable for Israel to remain there. And you start to see moves, not just in the Labour Party, even within the Likud, some more moderate wing of the Likud, let's say, to start asking questions about how we can change things in the territories. In 1988, Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, makes a speech in the United Nations in which he appears to signal that the PLO has renounced terrorism. It wasn't taken seriously by Israel at the time. It was taken more seriously by the United States, and they end their boycott of the PLO. So things are moving in a direction towards peace talks with the Palestinians, and specifically with the PLO, which of course happens in the 90s with the Oslo Accords. Again, I'm not going to go into all the history. I assume you know a lot of it. Anything you don't know and want to push me on, you can ask at the end of my presentation. But after the Oslo Accords are signed between Israel and the PLO, and we have the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza, and you start to see a very serious divide opening up between left and right in Israel. So one way of presenting it or representing it, let's say, is these extracts from a couple of speeches, one from Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister from the Labour Party, who comes to office in 1992, signs the Oslo Agreement, the first Oslo Agreement in 1993, and he makes this speech in the Knesset. And he says, "We are destined to live together on the same soil in the same land. We, the soldiers who have returned from battle stained with blood, we who have seen our relatives and friends killed before our eyes, we who have attended their funerals and cannot look into the eyes of their parents, we who have come from a land where parents bury their children, we who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today in a loud and clear voice, enough blood and tears, enough." Right? Peace is a priority for a number of reasons. Peace is a priority. Benjamin Netanyahu, who becomes prime minister after defeating Shimon Peres, who of course replaces Rabin after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the tragic assassination of Rabin in 1995, and then he's replaced by Shimon Peres, who loses the election to Netanyahu in 1996. And Netanyahu's election win is very much based on this idea that this move for peace has not brought us greater security, it has brought us less security, specifically suicide bombs. So the first suicide bombs in Israel happened in the 1990s. Hamas and Islamic Jihad set off suicide bombs in the streets of Israel for the first time. And 3 massive suicide bombs in February and March of 96 really moved the dial towards Netanyahu in the election campaign. And Netanyahu says in 96, terrorism has not ended. The implementation of the formula Land for Peace, which motivated Oslo's architects, was supposed to eliminate terrorism or at least radically reduce it. The exact opposite has occurred. Before Rabin agreed to sign the Oslo Accords, he demanded from Arafat a clear commitment for an all-out fight against terrorism. But except for superficial and isolated actions, the Palestinian Authority has done nothing in this regard, despite its repeated commitments. So there's 2 things there. One is the reference to the terrorism, which I mentioned, but also that specifically the person that we trusted, or that we were asked to trust to make peace with us and to move towards peace and increase our security, Yasser Arafat, can't be trusted, and that he isn't doing what he said he was going to do, that he's still the terrorist that he always was. And that's the message that Netanyahu runs on and wins a very narrow victory in the election of 96, basically because of that. Now, Netanyahu loses re-election in 1999. He's replaced by Ehud Barak from the Labour Party, the last prime minister from the Labour Party, Ehud Barak. And eventually it's Barak who finally reveals, if you like, the lack of sincerity or the lack of seriousness on the part of Arafat as a peace partner. So there's the collapse of the Camp David talks. There's a picture here of Barak sort of pushing Arafat into the talks with President Clinton, and it's kind of a comical picture, but it does actually represent a certain reality, which is that Arafat really didn't want to be there. And Clinton, who was coming to the end of his term as president, wanted this final push and this, I guess, his legacy, if you like, as president, to be the president that makes peace between Israel and the Palestinians. He's pushing it, but Barak also believes that it's the way that the Oslo process was flawed because it was incremental and it was too slow and gradual, and that actually the best way to do this is to do what Begin and Sadat did, and actually have a sort of, a few days American hosted peace talks, hammer everything out and come to an agreement. Now that doesn't happen, and Arafat walks away from the offers that Barak and Clinton make, and then within a couple of months we have the Second Intifada starting, and the combination of those two things, the collapse of the Camp David talks, the outbreak of the Second Intifada, lead to a complete collapse of trust among Israelis for the very idea that we actually have a partner for peace on the other side. Now there's one last ditch attempt for peace. So Clinton is coming to the end of his term. He's a lame duck president by December of 2000, and he puts forward this plan, the Clinton plan, which is the most far-reaching offer at that point that had ever been offered to the Palestinians. You can see the details there. I'm not going to read it out, but basically, a contiguous Palestinian state in almost all of the West Bank, all of Gaza, deals on refugees, deals on a capital in East Jerusalem, and Arafat turned it down. Barak, there's elections coming up. Barak, even though it goes further than Barak would probably have wanted to go, Barak accepts the offer in the hope that he can win re-election on basically using the election as a kind of referendum on the peace deal. But he never gets the chance to do that because Arafat turns it down. And this really is the final straw. So Ariel Sharon, who you see in the picture below, is elected, replacing Barak. Sharon, because we think of Sharon now as the prime minister that withdrew from Gaza, I think certainly those of us who are at the younger side of things, even younger than me, may find it hard to remember or don't know that when Sharon was elected in 2001, this was the election of the most hardline prime minister Israel had up to that point, right? Sharon was the man who was forced to quit as defense minister in the 1980s because he was found to be indirectly responsible for the deaths of Palestinian refugees at the hands of Lebanese militia at the end of the First Lebanon War. Sharon was really the idea that there were thousands of Israelis demonstrating on the streets of Israel in the 1980s, calling for the resignation of Sharon, and a lot of those same people ended up voting for him in 2001 because they buses were exploding on the streets, cafes and nightclubs were being targeted by suicide bombers, and they had no trust whatsoever in the Palestinian leadership, either in its ability to stop the terrorism, or more importantly, its desire to stop the terrorism. Right? They saw Arafat as completely complicit in it, and Sharon was exactly the sort of no-nonsense, tough guy, essentially, that they wanted as prime minister at that time. And there's, I'm going to read you a quote from David Horowitz, who today is the editor of the Times of Israel. Back then, was editor of the Jerusalem Post, or maybe even before that, the Jerusalem Report. And he wrote an excellent book about the Second Intifada, which I recommend, called Still Life with Bombers. And he basically writes it as someone who was a strong supporter of Oslo, who identified with the Israeli left, with the peace camp, and voted for Sharon. And he talks about how these three things, really, the collapse of Camp David, the start of the Second Intifada, and then Arafat walking away from the Clinton proposal, create this new Israeli consensus of what he called the consensus which combined, in his words, the grimly vindicated skeptic, right? Those that never believed in the sincerity of the Palestinians in the first place, and the disenchanted optimist, people like him that really did think that there was going to be that something could come out of Oslo. And these groups coalesced as an Israeli mainstream, a solid 2/3 of the electorate and sometimes more, that blamed Arafat for the collapsed attempt at peacemaking. And this consensus, whether or not it supported two states in principle, believed that peace was impossible for at least a generation. And we see there's the Labour Party loses the next election in 2003, falling to its lowest position at that point that it ever had. And the collapse of the peace camp, I should say, it didn't mean that everyone suddenly became a supporter of the settlement movement. And according to polls, a majority of Israelis seem to accept still remembered the lesson, if you like, or what they were encouraged to think about from the first Intifada, which was that Israeli rule of the Palestinians can't be a permanent solution. But they also remember the lesson of the second Intifada, which is that the Palestinian leadership, the so-called moderate Palestinian Authority, wasn't reconciled to Israel's existence, wouldn't accept the maximum that any Israeli government could realistically be expected to offer. And that essentially we'd been led down a naive or mistaken path by the left. Now we had the disengagement. Sharon does this dramatic disengagement from Gaza. He rejects the idea of returning to negotiations with the Palestinians. Even after Arafat dies in 2004, he's not convinced by the claim that Arafat's successor, Mahmoud Abbas, is genuinely interested in peace. But he did become convinced that it was in Israel's interest to gradually separate from the Palestinians. And so in the absence of an agreement to do that unilaterally, to withdraw Israeli soldiers and civilians from parts of the disputed territory, starting with Gaza and from these three small settlements isolated settlements in the northernmost part of the West Bank. I want you to look at these two demonstrations. One is in favor, the top one is against the disengagement. This is the color orange, which is the color of the anti-disengagement protesters, and the bottom one, which is supporting the disengagement. The country is very much split in two on the issue. Now, if you look at the top one, the opposition to disengagement was partly ideological, right? So you have religious settlers in particular who were against it as a matter of ideology, but there's also a security argument. The Hebrew at the topmost banner there says, Sharon Magaresh Tachat Esh. Sharon is expelling people under fire. And it's a warning which proves prophetic, and we'll get to that. If you look at the bottom demonstration, this is the peace camp demonstrating, right? The posters here refer to Havodah, which is the Labour Party, the name of the Labour Party in Hebrew. And they're essentially demonstrating in support of a Likud prime minister. They would probably, many of them at least, would probably still go for negotiations, but they can definitely sign up to the unilateralism idea as a plan B, because they still believe that peace is only going to come once Israel is no longer in the territory. So they support a withdrawal from the territories. Okay, so Israel withdraws, a very traumatic withdrawal in the summer of 2005. 2006 is really a pivotal year in the development of the national mood of Israel regarding peace and security. Sharon leaves the Likud and establishes a new party, Kadima, which explicitly places itself in the center of the debate. It accepts the left's view that Israel must find a way to end its rule over the Palestinians and separate from them, but it also accepts the right's view that there's no reliable peace partner on the other side. In January 2006, Sharon has a stroke, 2 strokes in fact, and lapses into a coma. But his successor as leader of Kadima, Ehud Olmert, runs for prime minister in the elections the following month on a platform of further unilateral withdrawals. And he wins that election. It's the first time that any party other than Likud or the Labour Party, or one of its manifestations, is leading the government. This brand new party is leading the government, and it wins that election on the basis of further unilateral withdrawal. So there is a lot of support in Israel at that point for the idea of withdrawal. The Likud, which is still holding on to this idea that Israel needs to stay in the territories, falls to its lowest point of just 12 seats in the Knesset. Now, the support for unilateralism might include some of the peace camp, but really the platform isn't talking about peace. It's about the Israeli interest, the Israeli national interest of establishing permanent borders and separating from the Palestinians. Olmert himself does end up trying to make peace, as we'll see, but the initial Kadima position is following Sharon's skepticism about peace. Ultimately, though, a series of events in 2006 completely destroy public support for unilateralism. One is that Hamas wins parliamentary elections and becomes the largest party in the Palestinian parliament, and they essentially use Gaza as a launching pad for rockets against Israel. Now, there were rockets before the disengagement. It's not the case as we sometimes might think, given the reports that the Qassams from Gaza started with this engagement. They did not. They were part and parcel of the Second Intifada, but they certainly increased massively after Israel withdraws its soldiers from the Gaza Strip. In June of that year, Hamas kidnaps a 19-year-old soldier called Gilad Shalit, and then in July, Hezbollah kidnapped 2 Israeli soldiers. They crossed the border from Lebanon and kidnapped 2 Israeli soldiers in the north of Israel. Why is that relevant? Because in both of these places, Gaza and southern Lebanon, these are both places that Israel withdrew from unilaterally. Okay, Gaza, I've mentioned. Lebanon, Israel withdraws from southern Lebanon in the year 2000. It's actually been covered quite a lot in the media recently because it was the 20th anniversary recently. But in both cases, Israel withdraws from these unilaterally without any peace agreement, and the Israeli right warn that the absence of the IDF will mean that these places will be filled by terrorists. Okay, and that's how it turns out essentially. Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, and the kidnapping of the 2 soldiers in southern Lebanon sparks the Second Lebanon War, which is lasts over a month and is hugely controversial and bloody conflict. Netanyahu comes back to power in 2009, very much on raising the status of the Israeli right and the Likud, very much on this basis that all these ideas that have been tried, from negotiations to unilateralism, have not only gone nowhere, have actually made us less secure, and we need and only a more uncompromising position offered by the Likud can keep us safe. Now, before these elections, we have one last attempt at peace by Ehud Olmert, who goes back to negotiations with the Palestinians with American support, the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration. Ultimately, it just serves to prove that Sharon was right to judge that Mahmoud Abbas would ultimately be no more able to accept a serious 2-state offer than Arafat. Olmert makes the most far-reaching offer ever, even more than the Clinton plan, and Abbas turns it down. This was not covered widely. You can read in the excellent book by Mark Levy, an Israeli-American journalist with the Associated Press, who actually uncovered this story that the Palestinians had turned it down flat by basically seeing an interview on Al Jazeera with one of the Palestinian senior officials, and the AP were not interested in the story. Right, he tried to sell the story to the AP, and they didn't want to run it, which also tells you something about the way the press cover the conflict. Right, that what by any objective standards is a huge story, was not covered because it basically goes against the established narrative that Israel is the party that is not interested in peace or is not serious in peace, and the Palestinians are the weaker party who are desperate for peace. Now Netanyahu comes back to power, and he wants to focus primarily on the Iran issue. I chose this picture deliberately. That's obviously Netanyahu at the UN talking about the Iran threat. But under pressure from the US, he does embark on negotiations with Abbas. Abbas walks away, despite Netanyahu freezing settlement building for 10 months, something that had never been done before, and in a later attempt, releasing Palestinian terrorists from prison. And I want to conclude here because I want to have time for questions, but I'll conclude with this. Netanyahu, as I said, Netanyahu wins the election in 2009. As we know, he's been prime minister since then, Israel's longest serving prime minister now. All subsequent elections from that election of 2009 have not really been fought over the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is interesting and unusual for Israel. In most democratic countries, elections are fought over the economy. As we know, the famous statement by James Carville in the Clinton administration is the economy stupid. That's what elections are fought over. Not in Israel. Traditionally, they were over issues of security. But that changed. And what's interesting is the elections that have been fought since that first election that brought Netanyahu back have been fought over different issues, over the economy, cost of living, the issue of ultra-Orthodox not serving in the army. And that I think is quite telling. One of the reasons for that is that we're in this situation now. Most Israelis feel themselves to be in what the Israeli writer and philosopher Mika Goodman called catch 67, right? So from catch 22, but 67, as in 1967, the year that Israel won the Six-Day War and conquered, reclaimed, liberated, however you want to put it, the West Bank and Gaza. And essentially, he's saying what I've discussed before, that most Israelis are not willing to withdraw from the West Bank because they fear what will happen the next day. They don't trust the Palestinian leadership, especially with what's going on in the Middle East right now with the so-called Arab Spring, which became very quickly an Islamist winter, with Iran backing Hamas and Hezbollah, with Syria collapsing into civil war and chaos. The idea that Israel would trust that the IDF leaves the West Bank, leaves Judea and Samaria, and that becomes a peaceful democratic Palestinian state this is not a realistic scenario that most Israelis believe in. And yet, despite that, there's also little mainstream appetite for expanding settlements and for a permanent Israeli control over the entire territory, and the old right's view of greater Israel, because of what it would mean for Israel's demography if you annex the territory and give citizenship to all the Palestinians that live there, or to Israeli democracy if you annex the territory and don't give the Palestinians citizenship. So Israel's in this situation, and Israelis feel themselves to be in this situation, and we now have this, as I said, this demise of the peace camp, where that issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, is just not one of the issues being discussed at elections. The last set of elections, the 3 elections we had in a year, from what is it, April last year to March this year, or something like that. We lose track. It saw the new blue and white party of Benny Gantz completely eclipse Labour as the alternative to Likud. And their position on the Palestinian issue isn't really that different from Likud's. Blue and white contained opponents of 2 states, supporters of 2 states, but really the supporters and the opponents agreed that there's no real partner for such an arrangement right now anyway. And so essentially they agree that solving the conflict is not something that's going to happen anytime soon. So the issues that divided Likud and Blue and White were about the nature of Israeli democracy, about the role of the Supreme Court, questions of religion and state, especially the power and influence of the ultra-Orthodox, and of course, most importantly, perhaps, whether Netanyahu should still be prime minister. These are all important and serious issues, but the peace question, at least the question of a permanent peace with the Palestinians, which had been the fundamental issue dividing left and right in Israel for 30 years or more, was simply not on the agenda. And as we saw at the beginning, the traditional left has been all but wiped out. A part of Labour, 2 members of Knesset, are now sitting as ministers in a government which is planning to extend sovereignty to parts of the West Bank, right, completely against the old peace camp ideas. And the other part is sitting in opposition with Meretz as three members of Knesset that are still holding on to a kind of two-state, a sort of imminent two-state provision. The major opposition party is Yesh Atid, and led by Yair Lapid, with Moshe Ya'alon as his number 2. And Lapid represents quite well the disillusioned two-state supporter. And Ya'alon is a former Likud defense minister who's basically a Likudnik. I mean, he opposes Netanyahu on issues of what he sees as corruption, but he's not. He's a Likudnik, and they're leading the opposition. And now you can think that the peace camp was too naive, or you can think they were right to at least attempt to solve the conflict. And I'm not here to tell you that either one of those is right or wrong. But either way, the peace camp failed, and it failed because ultimately there was no, and as far as we know, there is no still Palestinian Anwar Sadat. There's no Palestinian leader who is willing to say, you can start to take down the Iron Wall because we accept the right of the Jewish people to live here in their own state in peace and security. And with that, I will conclude.
Well, thank you very, very much for this amazing and powerful presentation. And now we'll be taking some questions if anyone has any questions to ask. So this is the best time. You can write them in the chat and we'll be reading them to Paul. And so let's give you 30 seconds to see if you have any questions. And you can also unmute yourself and ask the question as well if you would like. All right. Now, so Paul, we have one question. Now, you mentioned that Israelis don't trust the Palestinian leadership nowadays. So if we can look for something that will build that trust, what can it be? You know, looking into something positive, what can it be?
To build trust with Palestinians?
With their leadership, or so to speak, with anyone in order to move somehow forward.
Right. So, I mean, look, one way to answer that is to say that there are positive things happening at a grassroots level, right? That there are a number of coexistence projects, as they're called, that go on between ordinary Israelis and ordinary Palestinians, both at the level of just kind of friends, but also there are mutual business ventures that have been developed between Israeli and Palestinian entrepreneurs. Those kinds of things I think are very positive, and really, apart from the sort of ideological, like those on the ideological right who are opposed in perpetuity to any kind of Palestinian independence or of any kind in the West Bank, I think for most Israelis, whether they believe in a traditional two-state solution or something that's less than that, but still gives Palestinians more autonomy and independence than they have now, I think they would see a way of doing that as building up the Palestinian economy and Palestinian society, and that Israel can actually help to do that. That I think is something that Israel can be doing, should be doing, is doing to some extent, and maybe could be doing more of.
Awesome. And thank you. And the next question is, what are Israeli? We're talking about annexation soon. So, what do you think Israel will do or can do with the Palestinian population in the West Bank in case of annexation? Like, how would that work?
The annexation question is really up in the air, right? Because we don't know exactly when it's going to happen. There's talk of a delay. We also don't even know if it's going to happen, because now there's talk of it being sabotaged, ironically, by the settler leadership that have started raising complaints about it. And we also don't know if it does happen exactly what it will be, right? There's various possibilities. One is the full annexation that the Trump plan seems to call for, which is pretty much all the settlements in Judea and Samaria. But there's also more limited annexation, which looks more likely. Netanyahu's talked very specifically about the Jordan Valley, and there's also talk of annexing some of the blocks around Jerusalem, like Ma'ale Adumim. So it would depend on on what exactly is annexed. But look, no one really knows what the Palestinian reaction is going to be. The threats are that they'll end security cooperation completely, that maybe even the Palestinian Authority itself would disband. It's one of the strongest arguments actually against the annexation is that the consequences could be very dramatic, and that maybe the problem that the Israeli government has is that it's kind of in a rush, because the timetable is set by the American elections. Because if Trump loses those elections, then there would be an assumption. There's an assumption, I think, a correct assumption, that a Biden presidency wouldn't endorse the Trump plan, and therefore, if Israel wants to annex according to the contours of the Trump plan, it needs to do so before November and before those elections. So Israel feels itself to be in a rush, which might be problematic, because there could, ideally, Israel would want to do a lot more work in looking at and examining exactly what the consequences would be with regard to both the Palestinians and its relations with the Arab states that it's slowly building better relations with, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in particular.
Awesome, thank you, Paul. And we have the next question. What do you think of the Palestinian Authority end of security coordination with the IDF in Judea and Samaria? And
they're claiming this has already happened. I'm not sure if it's happened completely. As I understand it, the security coordination has certainly gone down, but it hasn't ended completely. This could be very bad. I mean, if it ends completely, then that's a bad thing, because we have had basically since one of the few positives actually that came out of the negotiations that started with Olmert and Abbas back in 2008-ish, 2007-2008, was the re-establishment of security cooperation between the PA and Israel, which has more or less worked, in the sense that the PA has helped the IDF clamp down on terrorism in the West Bank, not because they've suddenly become Zionists, more's the pity, but because it's in their interest as well. The worst thing that could happen for Mahmoud Abbas would be a Hamas takeover of the West Bank. So the end of security coordination would not be a good thing. Gantz, who's now defense minister, of course, recently had a meeting with senior IDF officials and said that we need to start preparing for the day after annexation, which could include the need for Israel to take a more proactive military role in Judea and Samaria. I think it would be a problematic thing and a bad thing. Look, it depends on where you are on this. If you're someone who really believes that annexation is an important thing ideologically to do that, then you say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we're not going to give in to Palestinian threats to stop us doing it. That's not my position. I have a more pragmatic position on it, and I think that that Israel would be well advised to think about the consequences.
Okay, thank you very much. And another question that keeps bringing up the annexation topic.
Okay, it's very current.
Yeah. Do you think that the annexation as part of the Trump plan would leave an area viable for a Palestinian state?
Okay, very good question. So according to the Trump plan, I think one of the difficulties here is that I think a lot of people, when they talk about the Trump plan, aren't quite sure what we're talking about, because there's the Trump plan that was presented, and which I think, and this is all speculation because no one knows unless they were in the room when these discussions were going on, but it seems like Jared Kushner, who was really, put in charge by Trump to do this, really believes in this as a way to genuinely create peace and a Palestinian state, and in a way which which kind of gets off the table all the issues that Israel has been concerned about in the past: the refugee issue, the issue of Jerusalem, security issues, and Israel would be secure. It would retain a united Jerusalem. There'll be no question of Palestinian refugees coming back, but there would be, according to Kushner's thinking, a viable Palestinian state. It wouldn't be territorially contiguous, but it would be connected by roads and bridges and other things, and you've seen the map. And then there's the other version of the Trump plan, which basically says, which I think seems to be, rightly or wrongly, seems to be more associated with American Ambassador David Friedman, which is essentially that Israel, that even if there's no Palestinian state, because the Palestinians aren't willing to play ball with this, that Israel can go ahead and annex anyway. That doesn't seem to be what Kushner had in mind, and it's not yet clear exactly what's going to happen with that. So let's say there's the first version of that. Would it be a viable Palestinian state? It's a good question. It doesn't look like, on a map, it doesn't look like any state that exists. I think it would be fair to say. That said, you could take a position to say, look, the Palestinian leadership, as I said in my presentation, has time and again rejected offers that would give it a Palestinian state in pretty much all of the West Bank and Gaza, or some 90% of it. And each time it said no. So now it's being offered something which is around 70% of the West Bank. And maybe that's just what it's going to have to swallow, because, if each time that you're offered something, you turn it down because you want it all, then essentially and this is really, one way of looking at the Palestinian story, the kind of tragic narrative of the Palestinian story, is that each time they've been offered a state, they've said no because they've been unwilling to compromise, and then each time the amount they're offered gets smaller. So you can go back historically and look at 1937, when the British proposed partition, and the Palestinians with the Arabs would have got a state in 80% of the land, and they said no because they didn't want the Jews to have 20%. Then the UN come along and offer them 50% and in 47, and they say no because they want it all. And then, in subsequent offers at Camp David and Clinton and Olmert, they're offered around 22%, and they say no, 22% of the territory as a whole. And each time they say no. So it might just be that this is something that they're going to have to swallow because they've said no on so many previous occasions. Whether there's a Palestinian leadership that will accept it is anyone's guess. Certainly the current leadership doesn't look like it will.
Thank you very much, Paul. Then we have another question, and that's a little bit of a different type of question. You're working at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and we all know that Menachem Begin was the role model to many people. And so can you tell us a little bit about the Menachem Begin Heritage Center as a whole, what it does? Or?
Great question. So it's doing much less at the moment, unfortunately, because of the situation that we all find ourselves in. But basically, the Begin Center was established to commemorate the life and legacy and ideas of Menachem Begin, who was Israel's 6th prime minister and one of the greatest leaders that Israel has had. We have an excellent museum here which tells the story of Menachem Begin. We also have educational programs that we run for both Israelis and non-Israelis. So for Israelis, we have run programs for soldiers and police officers on leadership, Menachem Begin's model of leadership. We also run programs for high school students on we have a program here called Junior Knesset, which kind of teaches them how the Knesset runs, because Begin was a member, before he was prime minister, was a member of parliament for for some 40 years, and was really an exemplary parliamentarian and Democrat, small d Democrat. And so the lessons of Israeli democracy are also very important that we teach here. We run a Masa program, if you're familiar with Masa, that has long-term programs in Israel, called the Israel Government Fellows Program, which does internships in the Israeli government for diaspora Jews to come here after university. That's actually a program I used to run. That was my old position here before I moved to what I do now. What I'm doing now is things like this, and also developing all kinds of educational material and events and lectures in English for English speakers in Jerusalem, and also, of course, English speakers around the world for online forums like this one.
Awesome. So, of course, if anyone wants to learn more about the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, it's all online, and they can look it up. And so,
you can also just feel free to email me, paulg@begincenter.org.il.
Awesome. And Paul, we'll take actually 2 more questions, last 2
Sure.
questions, and it's going to put us at the 1 hour mark. So one of the questions is, what do you think of David Eliani recently remarked that Trump doesn't have Israel's best interests at his heart? If we know
this is an interesting one, because this comes from David Eliani, who's one of the leading settler leaders, and there's this really extraordinary situation now where Netanyahu is kind of being buffeted from 2 sides, right? So the left or the center left, as you'd expect, is against annexation, but also the right don't like it either, because they say that, firstly, they don't like the fact that it talks about a Palestinian state, but also because they believe that it would create enclaves, that the settlements would be, some of the settlements would be inside enclaves where they're surrounded by Palestinian territory, and according to the Trump plan, they would not be able to expand further, right? The Trump plan, on the one hand, says that Israel can keep all the settlements, but it also says that those settlements can't expand further into what would become the Palestinian state. So the settlers don't like that. Doesn't have Israel's best interests at heart. Look, I don't want to get political on this. Trump, I think we can say whatever we think of Trump personally, he's certainly done a number of things as president, which have been very popular with Israelis, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, withdrawing from the Iran deal, recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. It would be hard to say that, it'd be hard to make the claim that Trump hasn't been, at least in terms of policy, a very pro-Israel president. Whether he has Israel's interest at heart, this is not something I think anyone can judge why he does things. Is it because he has some deep love of Israel? Maybe, maybe not. Is it because his daughter and son-in-law are Jewish and he has some connection because of that? Maybe. Or is it just because he's thinking along narrow political lines and he wants to get support from evangelical Christians in America, for whom these pro-Israel positions are very popular? Also, very possible. I don't know what's in his heart. I think that, it's a very undiplomatic thing for Eliani to say, and very problematic for Netanyahu that he's saying it. And certainly, I think, as I said, flies in the face of the general sense among most Israelis that Trump has, whatever he personally thinks, has done things that most Israelis approve of.
Awesome. And then the last question we will take today. So many people, of course, on college campuses and elsewhere support and advocate for a 2-state solution. In SSI, we don't have a response to it because we think that Israelis are smart enough and wise enough to make their own decisions, and we'll need to explain that. But do you see, what do you see in regards to 2 states, or we know that some Palestinians say that maybe it's even better to have 1 state nowadays. At the end of the day, where do you think that direction is going?
Right. So I'm not a fan of a 1-state solution at all. I think a 1-state solution would be problematic for all the reasons that it's been regarded as problematic historically, and the reasons why other previous right-wing prime ministers didn't decide to annex, including Begin, most importantly, didn't decide to annex all of territories when they took office, because they didn't want a situation where there would be where they would have to face the choice of whether to essentially offer citizenship to all the Palestinians, and therefore face a question of whether there might be at some point, either imminently or in the future, more Arabs than Jews in the area, in the entire area between the river and the sea, as I say, the entire land of Israel, or not to give them citizenship, and then Israel would it would be difficult it would be hard to still call Israel a democratic state. So I think because of that, a one-state idea is not good. Two states, look, as I said in my presentation, two states isn't going to happen anytime soon. And I think most people who would like to see two states in the future acknowledge that, which is why the left is kind of dead in the Knesset, and that the people and that the number of members of Knesset who actually think that a two-state solution is viable now is really just kind of three or four members of Knesset currently. What I do think is perhaps not on the table, but let's say if there were a more left-leaning government elected, I think the only change that would really happen would be some move towards trying to talk about keeping a two-state idea alive for the future, establishing better relations with the Arab states that could be partners in the future, so that we're not just dealing with the Palestinians, we're dealing with the wider Arab world as well, and to say that we shouldn't be doing anything to jeopardize two states. So that position would be against, I think, annexation of all the settlements, for example, but would say that we need to keep the idea of two states alive, even though it's not going to happen anytime soon. But two states is not realistic in the immediate term. It might be the best solution in the long term, but we're really talking the long term.
Well, Paul, first of all, we want to thank you very, very much for everything you just taught us, and for being such a great friend of Students Supporting Israel for so many years now. It was very educational. And we also want to remind everyone that this lecture is on Facebook, and it will also be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And also we want to invite everyone to join to our next webinars that will be taking place starting on Monday of next week by Yafa Segal from the International Legal Forum, and by Ofir Dayan, the President of SSI Colombia. And Paul, we also want to wish you say thank you for joining us that late at night. We know it is nighttime in Israel, and you are calling us from Israel. And of course, finishing by wishing the Arsenal a good start of the season. And we all know that you're a football fan, a British football fan. So we wish Arsenal best of luck.
Very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Goodbye.
Bye.